Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we trade the soft rustle of leaves for the low, frantic whisper of history's most baffling royal deaths. Close your eyes and imagine you're not in your comfortable bed, but a cavernous, gilded room where shadows dance on the damask walls and the only sound is the ticking of a grandfather clock, counting down the last strange moments of a king's life. A thick, oppressive silence hangs in the air, broken only by the monarch's own disjointed mutterings. You can feel the cold marble under your feet, the velvet of the curtains against your cheek. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, but then again, that's half the fun, isn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, why not leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you? I'd love to see how far our little community reaches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the royal palaces of the 18th and early 19th century Britain, a time when the world was changing faster than a royal servant running late for tea. You're standing on the precipice of the modern age, but the man on the throne is losing his mind in a way that feels ancient and unknowable. The final years of King George III are, quite frankly, a royal spectacle of tragedy and confusion, a slow-motion car crash of a man's psyche. You'd think a king, with all the power and privilege in the world, would have a tidy, dignified end. You'd be wrong. Instead, you're faced with a portrait of a monarch who was, at various points, convinced he was speaking with angels, believed a pillow was his long-dead son, and sometimes mistook the trees in the royal garden for the King of Prussia. And this wasn't some sudden dramatic break. It was a gradual descent, a chilling slide into a world only he could see, a world where his family, his court and his subjects were mere ghosts. The king's illness first truly reared its head in the mid-1780s, but it was the final decade of his life, from 1810 until his death in 1820, that saw the full, horrifying progression of his mental state. You can almost feel the collective unease of the royal household, a kind of silent dread as they watched their king unravel. The symptoms were a cocktail of confusion, agitation, hallucinations, and a complete loss of social inhibitions. Imagine the scene. A state dinner where the king begins to chatter inanely to the salt cellar, or a public address where he trails off mid-sentence, lost in a vision only he can perceive. The spectacle was both deeply sad and profoundly bizarre. His doctors, in a display of what can only be called medical desperation, tried everything from blistering his skin to, perhaps most notoriously, strapping him into a straitjacket. They even tried forcing him into cold baths, a kind of therapeutic shock that you can just picture being a profoundly unpleasant experience for everyone involved, especially the king. One of the more mainstream historical facts about this era is the so-called Regency crisis that his illness triggered. The king's incapacity meant that the government, and indeed the entire British Empire, was essentially rudderless. His son, the Prince of Wales, later George IV, was appointed regent in 1811, taking over the reins of power. This wasn't just a smooth transition. It was a deeply political and highly contentious affair that saw ministers and family members scrambling for influence, all while the king himself was locked away, an increasingly distant and forgotten figure. This period, known as the Regency, is famous for its excesses and its fashionable flamboyance, a stark contrast to the tragic figure of the old, blind and mad king rattling around in his darkened rooms. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that really highlights the strangeness of the situation. Among the many bizarre treatments, one stands out: the use of emetics and purgatives. The thinking, in a stunningly misguided act of 18th century medical logic, was that his madness was caused by some kind of internal blockage. So they would give him powerful medicines to make him vomit or use the privy. The idea was to literally flush the madness out of him. It's hard not to chuckle at the sheer absurdity of it, even as you feel a pang of sympathy for the poor man. You can imagine the doctor standing over the king, a kind of grim hope in his eyes, as if the next round of retching would suddenly clear his mind and restore him to sanity. It's a testament to how little was understood about mental illness at the time, and a poignant reminder of the lengths people will go to when they're desperate. As you stand in the ghostly palace hallways, you have to ask yourself, what was the actual cause of his illness? And this is where the historians still argue whether his affliction was a purely mental illness or something else entirely. For decades, the leading theory was that King George III suffered from porphyria, a genetic blood disorder. This theory, first proposed in the 1960s, gained a lot of traction because the symptoms, abdominal pain, erratic behaviour, and purple-coloured urine, all seemed to fit. The urine, a detail noted by his doctors, was a key piece of evidence. The purple colour is a classic sign of a porphyric attack, but in recent years this diagnosis has come under fire. Some historians and medical experts now argue that his symptoms, particularly the cognitive decline and dementia, are more consistent with bipolar disorder or even a form of early-onset dementia. They point out that a lot of his symptoms don't fit the porphyria model perfectly, and that his erratic behaviour could be a sign of a manic episode. The debate is ongoing, a kind of academic tug-of-war over a man who has been dead for 2 centuries. Was it a rare metabolic disorder, or a more common psychiatric one? The answer remains elusive, a historical whodunit that may never be solved. His final years were spent in a kind of waking sleep, his mind a fractured landscape of memory and fantasy. Blinded by cataracts and largely deaf, he was a prisoner in his own body, his family a rotating cast of shadows and muffled voices. The King of England, the man who had overseen the loss of the American colonies and the defeat of Napoleon, was reduced to a hollowed-out shell, muttering to himself in the empty rooms of Windsor Castle. His death in 1820 was less a shock and more a quiet conclusion to a long, drawn-out tragedy. You can picture the scene, the silent court, the relief mixed with sorrow, the final closing of a chapter that had been so bizarre, so agonisingly strange, that it had become a kind of public spectacle. The king was gone, but the mystery of his madness and the debate over its cause was just beginning. As the echoes of King George III's quiet demise fade from the halls of Windsor, a different kind of silence falls over you. This one is older, colder, and far more sinister. We're travelling back in time to the late 15th century and the sun-drenched, dust-filled plains of Castile. The air here doesn't have the damp, mossy scent of an English palace. It's dry and smells of sun-baked earth and the faint aroma of orange blossoms. You find yourself standing in the courtyard of a Spanish castle, the stone walls worn smooth by centuries of sun and wind. This is the stage for our next royal death, one that has puzzled historians for over 500 years. The victim is a woman whose name you know, a figure so central to history, she seems less a person and more an idea. Isabella I of Castile, the queen who bankrolled Columbus and ushered Spain into its golden age. The last years of Isabella's life were a slow, agonising slide into what we would now call a state of profound, lingering illness. You'd imagine a queen of her stature would have a quick, merciful end, perhaps in her sleep. Instead, you're faced with the grim reality of a woman who was slowly, inexorably wasting away. Her death, on November 26, 1504, was not sudden. She had been suffering for a long time, her body failing her with each passing day. The official cause of death was attributed to a variety of ailments, including a severe dropsy, a term for what we now know as edema, or swelling of the body, and a fever. But to some, this medical explanation felt a little too neat, a little too convenient. Whispers started almost immediately, slithering through the court like unseen serpents. The whispers said a different kind of dropsy was at play, one caused not by natural failure, but by a substance far more insidious. The whispers said she had been poisoned. One of the mainstream historical facts we have is that Isabella's health had been in decline for several years, exacerbated by the grief of losing her only son, her oldest daughter, and her son-in-law in quick succession. This kind of crushing loss would take a toll on anyone, let alone a queen who had shouldered the immense weight of building a unified kingdom. Her grief was well documented, a sorrow so deep it became a kind of public spectacle. Her symptoms, as recorded by her physicians, included severe abdominal pain, fatigue, and the aforementioned swelling. The general consensus among her contemporaries was that she died of natural causes, a body and spirit simply worn out by age, grief, and the relentless demands of her position. They probably just thought, well, of course she died. Look at what she's been through. But now for a quirky or fringe tidbit that really throws a wrench into the narrative. The rumours of poisoning, while unsubstantiated, found a convenient suspect in her husband, King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Now, you might be thinking, why on earth would her loving husband want to poison her? Well, remember that royal marriages were less about romance and more about political alliances and power plays. The two of them had built their kingdom together, but they had also had their fair share of political disagreements. After Isabella's death, the crown of Castile would pass to their daughter, Joanna, who was married to a man Ferdinand absolutely loathed, Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg prince. Ferdinand feared losing his influence and power in Castile. It's not a huge leap to imagine that he might have seen his wife's illness as a convenient way to consolidate his own power, perhaps by hastening the inevitable. The poison of choice in these rumours was arsenic, a substance so readily available and so hard to detect in that era that it was a favourite tool of would-be assassins. Arsenic poisoning, with its symptoms of abdominal pain and general malaise, could easily be mistaken for a chronic illness, making it the perfect crime weapon for a patient already wasting away. And this leads us to the heart of our historical puzzle. To this day, historians still argue whether her death was a natural decline or a quiet, calculated act of poisoning. The circumstantial evidence is, to put it mildly, intriguing. You have a powerful king with a clear motive. You have a queen with a long-term illness whose symptoms could be explained by a slow dose of poison. And you have the political turmoil that followed her death, exactly as Ferdinand had feared. Philip the Handsome and Joanna came to Castile to claim the throne, and Ferdinand found himself marginalised and struggling to maintain his power. This messy political fallout makes the idea of a premeditated murder all the more plausible. Proponents of the natural causes theory, however, point to the lack of any definitive proof. There were no contemporary reports of foul play, and no one was ever brought to trial or even officially accused. To them, the poisoning theory is just a salacious rumour, a post-mortem attempt to cast a sinister shadow on a powerful, successful king. The truth, like so many secrets of the past, remains buried with the bones of those who knew it. Imagine for a moment you're an ambitious historian, sifting through the dusty documents of the time. You're reading the physician's notes, the letters from the court, the diplomatic correspondence. You're looking for that single, solid piece of evidence, a coded message, a confession, but all you find are vague descriptions of illness, polite condolences, and the constant hum of political manoeuvring. The absence of evidence is, in itself, a kind of clue. Was the poisoner so good they left no trace, or was there simply no poisoner at all? The question hangs in the air unanswered, a ghost in the annals of history. The legacy of Isabella is vast and undeniable, but the quiet mystery of her final days adds a layer of human frailty and potential malice that complicates the glorious portrait. You think of her as the woman who funded a new world, but remember that she was also a woman who was slowly, agonisingly, dying. And as you walk away from the sun-drenched courtyard, you can't help but wonder if the hands that closed her eyes for the last time were those of a grieving husband or a cold-blooded killer. It's a question that keeps history alive, the constant whisper of what if. As you leave the dusty halls of 15th century Spain, the air grows cool again, and you find yourself moving toward a very different kind of world, one of ancient pyramids and golden tombs, where the mysteries are not of political intrigue, but of a sudden, brutal death. We're going to the land of the pharaohs, where a boy king met a shockingly violent end. Leave the political machinations of a Spanish court behind and feel the air shift. It grows dry, hot, and thick with the scent of sand and ancient stone. You're no longer in a castle courtyard. You're standing at the entrance to a tomb, deep in the Valley of the Kings. The year's not the 15th century, but the 14th century BC, and you're surrounded by the silent, colossal weight of millennia. The sun beats down on the ochre-coloured cliffs, and the only sound is the rustle of your clothes and the faint, distant echo of a wind that has been blowing here for thousands of years. We're here to talk about a pharaoh whose name is synonymous with mystery and gold, Tutankhamun, the boy king. But we're not here to marvel at his treasures. We're here to unravel the shocking truth of his death. For decades, the story of Tutankhamun's death was a kind of historical shrug. He was a young king, frail and sickly, who simply died. Perhaps a fever, perhaps a congenital defect. After all, he was the last of his line, the final member of a dynasty that had been rocked by religious upheaval and political strife. His death, at the tender age of 19, seemed tragic but mundane. That narrative, however, began to crack and crumble in the face of modern science and persistent curiosity. The discovery of his tomb in 1922 was a marvel, but the real mystery began when scientists started to look at the boy king's remains. What they found suggested a death that was anything but natural. It was a violent end, one that could have been an accident or, more chillingly, a deliberate act. One of the mainstream historical facts that has been established is that King Tut suffered from a number of physical ailments. Modern medical examinations of his mummy have revealed a fragile body plagued by a clubfoot, a fractured left thigh bone, and a severe case of malaria. His body was also weakened by bipolar disease too, a condition that affects the blood supply to the bones, which likely made it painful for him to walk. You can almost see him now, a young man hobbling around the opulent palace, a king with a body that was failing him, even as he ruled the most powerful empire in the known world. These physical weaknesses make a sudden death from natural causes seem plausible, but they also make him incredibly vulnerable. And here's where a quirky or fringe tidbit enters the picture, one that sounds like it's ripped straight from an action movie. One of the theories about King Tut's death is that he was killed in a chariot crash. Imagine this. A young, inexperienced king may be trying to prove his strength and skill despite his physical limitations, racing across the desert in a two-wheeled chariot. The air rushes past you, the sun is in your eyes and the ground is a blur of sand and stone. Suddenly a wheel hits a rut or a horse stumbles and the whole thing careens out of control. The king is thrown, his fragile body slamming into the hard desert floor. A chariot crash would certainly explain the severe fracture in his leg and other potential injuries, but it's a theory that's not without its problems. It's a grand, dramatic explanation for a very subtle set of injuries. Was he truly so reckless? Or is this just a romanticised version of a much grimmer reality? And this leads us to the biggest debate of all. Historians still argue whether Tutankhamun's death was an accident or a murder. The strongest piece of evidence for the murder theory came in the form of a detailed CT scan of his mummy in 2005. The scan revealed a shocking piece of information, a large fracture at the base of his skull. The initial interpretation was that this fracture was caused by a sharp blow to the head, perhaps from a mace or a ceremonial staff. It suggested a brutal, swift act of violence. This finding threw the history world into a frenzy. Was the boy king assassinated? If so, who was responsible? The two main suspects were his vizier, Ay, and the commander of his army, Horemheb. Both men were powerful figures in the court, and both had much to gain from the young king's demise. Ay, in particular, became the king after Tutankhamun's death, and even married his widow. It's a plot worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, isn't it? The faithful vizier, secretly a power-hungry plotter, waiting for his moment to strike. However, the scientific community has since pushed back on the murder-by-head trauma theory. They argue that the skull fracture might have happened after death, perhaps during the mummification process or when the body was being handled by early tomb raiders. The embalmers, in their haste to remove the brain, could have accidentally caused the injury. Other scans also show that the break was not clean, which would be expected from a sharp blow. Furthermore, while the broken leg was a severe injury, it also showed no signs of healing, which means it likely occurred just before he died. This makes the chariot crash theory more plausible. A terrible fall from a chariot could have broken his leg, and the subsequent infection, with no antibiotics to fight it, could have easily killed him. This new information doesn't rule out murder, but it does make it less certain. Was it a mace to the head, or a chariot wheel to the body? The answers are as buried as the king himself. You're a detective now, a forensic historian in a sterile modern lab, staring at a computer screen that displays the ghostly image of a 3,000-year-old body. You see the fractures, the faint signs of disease, the delicate bones of a young man who died too soon. And you have to make a choice. Do you believe in a spectacular, violent murder, a conspiracy that would change the course of history? Or do you believe in a more mundane but still tragic accident? The lack of clear-cut evidence allows for both narratives to coexist, fueling a debate that shows no signs of resolution. Every new discovery, every new scientific analysis, seems to add another layer of complexity rather than provide a clear answer. The boy king is still holding his secrets close. As we move forward, we'll delve deeper into the investigation, focusing on the evidence that points to a specific kind of death, one that has captivated the public imagination for a century. We will look at the people who stood to gain from his death and the political landscape of the time. The story of Tutankhamun's death is not just about a body in a tomb. It's about power, ambition, betrayal, and the enduring human fascination with a mystery that has spanned 3 millennia. So, let's leave the sweltering heat of the Valley of the Kings behind and move on to the next chapter of this bizarre and tragic tale. As the sun sets over the Valley of the Kings, casting long dark shadows across the ancient cliffs, we find ourselves still pondering the fate of the boy king. In the last section, we left you with the tantalizing possibility of a murder, a conspiracy shrouded in the dust of millennia. Now, let's pick up that thread and pull it taut, examining the evidence and the suspects with the cold, unblinking eye of a detective. The core of this mystery, you'll remember, is the discovery of a skull fracture in Tutankhamun's remains. This isn't just a minor detail, it's a potential smoking gun, a blow that could have ended a dynasty and changed the course of ancient history. You're no longer a passive observer. You're an armchair forensic anthropologist staring at the ghostly X-rays and CT scans of Tutankhamun's head. The image is stark, a prominent fracture at the base of the skull, a sign of a violent, blunt force trauma. This is a mainstream historical fact that has been widely reported since the 2005 CT scan. The implications are enormous. A young man, a king, dies suddenly and violently. The cause of death isn't a long, drawn-out illness. It's a quick, brutal blow. This discovery immediately reignited the debate about his death, turning it from a simple medical mystery into a full-blown murder investigation. The moment the news of the skull fracture broke, the historical community began to point fingers. The most obvious suspects were the men who stood to gain the most from Tutankhamun's death. First, you have I, the chief vizier and a man of immense power and influence. He was an older man who had served under Tutankhamun's father Akhenaten and the young king himself. When Tutankhamun died, I swiftly took the throne, married Tutankhamun's widow, and was crowned king. It's the kind of power grab you read about in thrillers. He had the motive, the opportunity, and he took full advantage of the situation. It's hard not to look at him and think, yep, he did it. Then there's Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army. He was a highly ambitious general who had been instrumental in restoring order after the religious chaos of Akhenaten's reign. He also had a very clear path to power. After A's short reign, Horemheb became the next pharaoh, and he spent his time systematically erasing all records of both Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. He wanted to wipe them from history as if they never existed. This act of damnatio memoriae, a quirky or fringe tidbit, suggests a deep-seated contempt or perhaps a desire to erase his own potential involvement in the events that led to his rise to power. Would a man who respected his pharaoh go to such lengths to erase his memory? It's a chilling thought, and it certainly makes him look guilty. Maybe he didn't deliver the killing blow, but perhaps he was the puppet master, pulling the strings from the shadows. So, who delivered the fatal blow? The murder theory posits that it was a hit, a carefully orchestrated assassination carried out by an agent of either A or Horemheb. Perhaps it was during a private audience, or maybe the attacker was a trusted guard who was later silenced. You can almost feel the tension in the air of the royal palace, whispers and glances and a constant low-level hum of anxiety. In a world where a king's life was paramount, the very idea of an assassination was unthinkable, but the evidence of the skull fracture makes it seem very, very thinkable. However, remember what we talked about in the last section? This is where the debate gets really sticky. To this day, historians still argue whether the skull fracture was a sign of foul play or simply a post-mortem injury. The scientists who conducted the original CT scan were confident it was caused by a blow, but later analysis by other teams of researchers cast doubt on their findings. They argued that the fracture looked more like a break that occurred after death, perhaps during the mummification process itself. The embalmers, in their haste to remove the brain, could have accidentally caused the injury. Or maybe, when the tomb was being plundered by ancient looters, the body was mishandled, leading to the damage. This is a crucial point. If the fracture happened after death, then the entire murder theory falls apart and we're back to a tragic accident or illness. Another point of contention is the spear or sword wound that was discovered on his torso. A 2010 study using DNA evidence concluded that Tutankhamun likely died from a severe combination of malaria and a fractured left leg. The theory is that the broken leg got infected, and the malaria, which was common in the region, was the final straw. But wait, what about that spear wound? Some people claim that his torso showed a puncture wound, which could have been caused by a spear or sword thrust. This tidbit, while fascinating, has been largely debunked. The wound was most likely a hole in the resin used to embalm the body. The rumour, however, persists, and it's a perfect example of how an intriguing but unproven detail can fuel a historical conspiracy. Ultimately, the debate boils down to two conflicting narratives. You have the romantic, dramatic murder plot, with A as the prime suspect, a ruthless schemer who would stop at nothing to get the throne. The evidence for this is circumstantial but compelling. A sudden death, a powerful motive, and a quick and suspicious rise to power for the very person who would benefit the most. On the other hand, you have the more scientific and perhaps mundane explanation. A young, sickly king, weakened by disease, suffers a terrible accident, a fall from a chariot or a horse, and dies from a subsequent infection. The skull fracture in this version of events is just an unfortunate side effect of the mummification process, a historical red herring that has led generations of scholars down the wrong path. The truth is, we may never know for certain. The lack of contemporary accounts, the systematic erasure of his name from the monuments, and the simple passage of time have made it nearly impossible to get a clear answer. The boy king is still holding his secrets close, his mummified body a silent witness to events we can only guess at. He lies in his golden sarcophagus, surrounded by the treasures of his life, but the real treasure, the truth about his death, remains hidden in the shadows of the past. As you step away from the tomb, the hot desert air feels a little less oppressive, a little more like a distant memory. We are leaving the world of pharaohs and conspiracies and travelling to a different time and a different kind of madness. Our next journey takes us to medieval France, where a king, not weakened by disease or a blow to the head, was convinced he was made of glass, and feared he would shatter at any moment. The deaths of kings, it seems, are not always about violence and intrigue. Sometimes they are simply about the tragic and bizarre reality of the human mind. As the hot wind of ancient Egypt gives way to the cooler, more humid air of 14th century France, a new kind of dread settles in. The mystery of Tutankhamun's death was about power and intrigue, a secret held by the sands of time. This story, however, is a tragedy of a different kind, one born not of a conspiratorial plot, but of a mind unravelling in plain sight. We are entering the court of King Charles VI, a monarch whose reign was not defined by his conquests or his policies, but by a descent into a madness so profound and so bizarre that it earned him the moniker Charles the Mad. Picture yourself in the great hall of a French chateau. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke, expensive perfumes, and the stale aroma of too many people in one place. Unlike the hushed suspense of the Egyptian tomb, this place is alive with a nervous energy, a constant hum of whispers and worried glances. The reason for this anxiety is simple: the man on the throne. Charles VI was, for all intents and purposes, a living ghost, a king whose mind was a fractured landscape of delusions and terrifying fits. You might be accustomed to the image of a dignified, stoic monarch, but Charles VI was anything but. The king's first major psychotic episode occurred in 1392, an event known as the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. This is a mainstream historical fact, and it's a story so wild it sounds like something from a fever dream. To celebrate a friend's wedding, Charles and 5 of his knights dressed up as wild men, covered in a flammable tar-like substance and adorned with flax. You can just picture the scene. A dark, crowded hall, the flicker of torches, and a group of half-naked, wild-looking men dancing wildly. It was all a bit of fun, until a torch was accidentally brought too close to the dancers. The flames erupted in a flash, turning the spectacle into a horrifying inferno. 4 of the knights died instantly, and the king himself was barely saved, his life spared by the quick thinking of his aunt, who threw her dress over him. The shock of this event was too much for Charles's fragile psyche. After the fire, his mental state deteriorated rapidly. He began to suffer from violent fits of rage, memory loss, and a terrifying inability to recognise his own wife and children. But the most bizarre and lasting delusion that took hold of his mind was the belief that he was made of glass. This quirky or fringe tidbit is one of the most famous and unsettling aspects of his story. Imagine believing, with every fibre of your being, that your body was brittle and fragile, that a simple bump or fall could shatter you into 1,000 pieces. The king refused to be touched, fearing that he would break. He would wrap himself in thick blankets and padded clothing, and he would move with a slow, deliberate caution, as if his every step could lead to his demise. His servants had to be extremely careful around him, and the slightest sound of breaking glass would send him into a panic. This wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a full-blown obsession that ruled his life for years. He even had iron rods sewn into his clothing to keep his glass body from shattering. You can almost feel the weight of that fear on your own shoulders. It's not a common delusion, but it's a potent one, a kind of existential terror that keeps you constantly on the brink. You can see the dark humour in it, a king who had the power to command armies and rule a kingdom, and yet he was utterly powerless against a phantom fear that consumed his every waking moment. The man who had been a celebrated leader, a man of flesh and blood, was now an object, a fragile sculpture living in a state of perpetual dread. The cause of his madness is a subject of intense historical debate. Historians still argue whether Charles VI suffered from schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or a form of organic brain damage. Some scholars point to the violent and dramatic swings in his mood, from wild fits of rage to periods of deep depression and catatonic withdrawal, as evidence of bipolar disorder. Others argue that the hallucinations, delusions, and severe cognitive decline are more consistent with a schizophrenic break. A third theory, which is perhaps more compelling, is that his madness was caused by a series of traumatic brain injuries. The Bal des Ardents, while terrifying, was not the only physical trauma he endured. He was also a passionate hunter and often fell from his horse, which could have led to repeated concussions. The combination of a highly stressful life and repeated head trauma could have been the perfect storm, a kind of physical and mental breakdown that was simply too much for his brain to handle. His final years were a slow, agonizing slide into total senility. He would sit for hours on end staring into space, lost in a world only he could see. The kingdom, in his absence, was plunged into a series of civil wars and power struggles, with his wife and family members vying for control. He died in 1422, a broken man in a broken kingdom, his life a stark and chilling reminder that even the most powerful monarchs are not immune to the ravages of the mind. You're a silent observer in this chaotic court. You see the worried faces of the courtiers, the frustrated glances of his family, and the pained exhaustion in the eyes of his servants. They tried everything to help him, from religious rituals to leeches, but nothing worked. The Glass King was a mystery, a living enigma that they could not solve. His death was not a dramatic, sudden event, but a quiet, merciful release from a life that had become a waking nightmare. As you leave the gloomy halls of medieval France, you can't help but feel a profound sense of sadness for the man who was so terrified of breaking. It's a kind of death that is far more haunting than any murder or conspiracy. And as we leave him to his final rest, we move to a different kind of post-mortem ritual, one that is as macabre as it is steeped in history. We're going to the court of Henry VIII to witness the final, gruesome journey of a woman whose heart in death was as restless as it was in life. As the memory of the French Glass King fades, replaced by a quiet sense of unease, we find ourselves on a different, but no less unsettling stage. The air grows damp and cool, and the scent of rain-soaked earth and old stone fills your lungs. We're in England, in the grim grey halls of the Tower of London, a place synonymous with betrayal and execution. This is the year 1536, and the central figure in our macabre little play is a woman you know well, a queen whose life ended not with a whimper, but with the cold, swift flash of a sword. This is the story of Anne Boleyn, and the bizarre, secret journey of her heart after her death. You stand on the ancient cobblestones, the very ground where a scaffold was erected for a queen's execution. You can almost hear the hushed whispers of the crowd, the final, desperate prayers of a woman betrayed by the man she loved. Anne Boleyn's death is a mainstream historical fact, an event so pivotal that it literally changed the course of a nation's religion. On May 19th, 1536, she knelt on the scaffold, prayed, and was beheaded by a master swordsman from France, a final, merciful act ordered by her husband, King Henry VIII. Her body was unceremoniously buried in an unmarked grave inside the Tower's chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. A grim end to a turbulent life, you'd think. But the story doesn't end there. Here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of quiet, unsettling mystery to her final resting place. For centuries, a persistent rumour has circulated, a whisper in the dark corners of historical record. The rumour claims that Anne's heart was removed from her body after her execution, placed in a small silver box and smuggled out of the tower. The alleged motive for this grisly act is a matter of pure speculation. Was it a secret act of devotion by one of her loyal servants, a kind of posthumous tribute to a woman who'd been so cruelly maligned? Or was it a last quiet act of rebellion, an attempt to ensure that at least a part of the Queen would not be buried in a dishonoured grave? The heart in this context becomes a symbol of her spirit, a relic of her defiance. The rumour says that this heart was then taken to the family church, St Mary's Church in Irwerton, Suffolk, and buried near a yew tree on the grounds. The idea of a queen's heart being secretly preserved and buried is not as strange as it sounds. In a way, it's a callback to medieval traditions. For centuries, it was common for the bodies of monarchs and nobles to be dismembered and buried in different places, a kind of symbolic gesture of spreading their power and influence. For example, a king's heart might be buried in one church, his entrails in another, and his main body in a third. This practice, known as morbid anatomy, was a bizarre and gruesome form of post-mortem ritual, and it makes the story of Anne's heart seem almost plausible. It's a macabre twist on a forgotten tradition, a final secret act of piety or rebellion. But, of course, there is no definitive proof. Historians still argue whether the story of the silver box is a true historical event or just a persistent romantic legend. Proponents of the legend point to the fact that during a 19th century restoration of St Mary's Church, a heart-shaped lead casket was found inside a niche in the wall. The casket was opened, and while it was empty, it was a physical artefact that seemed to support the legend. Could this have been the very silver box, its contents long since degraded to dust? It's a tantalising piece of circumstantial evidence, the kind of thing that makes a good story. However, skeptics are quick to point out that there is no documentation, no contemporary account, and no verifiable evidence that Anne Boleyn's heart was ever removed from her body. They argue that the story is a post-mortem fabrication, an attempt by her sympathisers to give her a more dignified, if bizarre, end. To them, the heart-shaped box is just a coincidence, a common funerary artefact that has been retroactively linked to a famous queen. Imagine the scene. It's night, and a lone figure is sneaking through the silent, oppressive grounds of the Tower of London. A small, heavy box held close to their chest. The box contains not just a biological organ, but the very essence of a queen who was, in her life, both hated and adored. The person is perhaps a devoted servant, a member of her family, or maybe even a priest who was present at her execution. The journey would have been perilous, a secret so dangerous that it would have to be carried out under the cover of darkness. The person would have to live with this secret for the rest of their life, knowing they had defied a king and given a queen a final secret act of grace. The legend of Anne Boleyn's heart adds a layer of profound pathos to her story. It transforms her from a political casualty into a kind of tragic hero, a woman whose spirit was too large to be contained in a simple grave. It suggests that even in death, her legacy was a source of defiance, a quiet, unspoken challenge to the man who had ordered her death. The story of the silver box is a ghost story, a whisper from the past that refuses to be silenced. It's a testament to the power of a legend, a testament to how the human need for a good story can often supersede the need for hard, cold facts. As you turn away from the Tower of London, you can almost see the phantom figure, a queen's ghost, searching for the final resting place of her heart. The story is a grim and beautiful one, a quiet counterpoint to the thunderous pronouncements of a king. It reminds us that history is not just about the grand sweep of events, but also about the small, secret acts of love and loyalty that are often lost to time. We leave this chilling scene behind and travel north, to the misty fjords and jagged coastlines of Scandinavia. Our next story is about a king whose death was anything but quiet, a violent end that was both brutal and, perhaps, a betrayal of the highest order. As the quiet ghost of a beheaded queen fades from the damp air of England, the scenery changes dramatically. The sky overhead darkens and a cold, salt-laden wind whips through your hair. The gentle hills of England give way to the rugged, forested coastlines of 10th century Scandinavia. The air here smells of wood smoke, iron, and the cold, grey sea. You stand on the edge of a fjord, the water dark and choppy, and you can hear the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. This is the world of the Vikings, a world of sagas, blood feuds, and brutal, often bizarre ends for its rulers. The king we're here to talk about is a figure so famous his name has been repurposed for modern technology. We're talking about Harald Bluetooth Gormson, the man who brought Christianity to the Danes and united the disparate tribes of what is now Denmark. His death, however, was anything but a peaceful, pious passing. The story of Harald Bluetooth's reign is a mainstream historical fact, a narrative of a powerful, clever king who managed to unite the Danish kingdoms and briefly controlled a large part of what is now Norway and Sweden. He's credited with building a series of ring fortresses, which were highly advanced for their time, and for converting to Christianity. This conversion, while a political move to curry favour with the powerful Holy Roman Empire, was a monumental shift in the history of the region. He was a savvy ruler, a man who understood that a world of scattered tribes and pagan rituals was giving way to a world of unified kingdoms and organised religion. He seemed like an unstoppable force. But as is often the case in these stories, his greatest threat came from within. Here's where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in, one that adds a layer of familial drama to an already violent world. The most common account of Harald's death is that he was killed in a battle against his own son, a man named Sween Forkbeard. But there's a legend, a tantalising whisper in the sagas, that his death was not just a result of the battle, but a direct act of betrayal by one of his own men. The legend says that during the chaotic fighting, one of Sween's men, a warrior who was also a skilled archer, was tasked with a specific grisly mission, to kill the king. The archer was said to have hidden among the trees waiting for his moment. He had with him a special arrow, a singing arrow, that had been prepared with a certain spell or curse. The arrow was meant to be a kind of magical projectile, a way to ensure the king's death. This kind of pagan mysticism, existing in the same story as a Christian king, is a fascinating and weird contradiction. The idea that a king who had brought a new religion to his people would fall to a magical cursed arrow is a kind of historical irony that's hard to ignore. But the story gets even more personal and tragic. The sagas recount a climactic battle between father and son. Imagine the scene. Two armies clashing on a windswept field, the sound of steel on steel, and the guttural roars of men locked in mortal combat. In the midst of this chaos, a figure emerges on the horizon, a man with a bow and arrow, and he aims for the king. According to the sagas, the archer, a man named Toffee, shot Harald, but the arrow was not enough to kill him outright. The wound was mortal, but Harald managed to escape the battlefield, fleeing to a place called Jomsborg. He died shortly after, not on the battlefield with his men, but alone, in exile and in pain. His death was a grim, lonely end for a man who had forged a kingdom. And this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. Historians still argue whether Harald's death was a straight-up assassination by a rival, or just the result of a battle wound that proved fatal. The sagas are not always the most reliable historical sources. They often blur the line between fact and legend, adding dramatic flourishes to a story that may have been more mundane. The assassination theory, with its cursed arrow and its specific named archer, makes for a great story, but is it true? Proponents of the theory argue that it explains why Harald's flight from the battle was so desperate and quick. He wasn't just losing, he was specifically targeted. His son Sween, who had a fierce rivalry with his father, would have had every reason to want him dead. A clean, quick assassination would have settled the matter, with far less bloodshed than a protracted civil war. However, the more pragmatic historical view is that Harald was simply a casualty of war. In a violent, brutal society where power was often won on the battlefield, the idea of a king dying in combat against his rebellious son is not only plausible, it's highly probable. The arrow wound in this version of the story was just one of many, a fatal blow delivered in the heat of a chaotic battle. The story of the cursed arrow and the specific archer, Toffee, is just a dramatic embellishment added later to make the story more compelling. It gives a brutal, anonymous death a face and a name. The truth, as it often is, may lie somewhere in the middle. Perhaps Harald was indeed shot by an archer, but it was just a random act of violence in a battle, not a planned assassination. The sagas, in their telling, may have just embellished the story to make it more tragic and more fitting for a king who had tried to change the face of his nation. The conflict between a father who brought Christianity and a son who, at least initially, clung to the old pagan ways, adds a layer of deep, ideological conflict to the story. Harald's death was not just a physical defeat, it was a symbolic one, a brutal end to an era of change and unification. As you stand on the shores of the cold grey sea, you can't help but think about the fate of the man who gave his name to a technology that unites us all. The king of Bluetooth, of all people, died in a very analogue, very violent way. His death was not in a sterile palace, or on a grand battlefield where his men could witness his final moments, but in a distant, forgotten corner of his kingdom, a lonely and brutal end. It's a testament to the messy, often contradictory nature of history. We are leaving the world of Viking sagas behind and travelling to a different kind of ancient civilization, one that was ruled not by kings and their rebellious sons, but by pharaohs and their divine, often fearsome pets. Our next stop is ancient Egypt, where a queen's death may have been caused by a different animal entirely, as the salty sea air of Scandinavia gives way to the dry, oppressive heat of the Nile Delta. You find yourself on the banks of a river that has cradled civilization for millennia. We've left the world of Viking sagas and father-son betrayals for a story that is as much myth as it is history, one that features the last great pharaoh of Egypt, a woman whose name is a symbol of power, beauty, and tragedy. This is the story of Cleopatra, and the long-held belief that she died by the bite of an asp, a small venomous snake. But as we've seen, the most famous stories are often the most suspect. The death of Cleopatra VII is a mainstream historical fact, an event so famous it has been immortalised in art, literature and film for centuries. The story goes like this. After the defeat of her and Mark Antony's forces by Octavian, Cleopatra retreated to her mausoleum. Fearing the humiliation of being paraded through the streets of Rome as a conquered queen, she chose to die on her own terms. The legend says she had a servant bring her a basket of figs, within which was hidden a small poisonous snake, an asp. She supposedly held it to her breast, and with a single bite she ended her life. The symbolism is powerful. A queen, like the goddesses of old, choosing a divine end, the snake a symbol of royal power. But what if the serpent wasn't a snake at all? What if it was a crocodile? This is a quirky or fringe tidbit that, while not widely accepted, is not entirely without merit. The story, first mentioned by the historian Strabo, suggests that Cleopatra's death was far more violent and less romantic than the snakebite legend. According to this account, she didn't die by her own hand, but rather she was killed by a crocodile. Now, you're probably thinking, a crocodile? That's ridiculous, and you're right, it sounds completely absurd. A queen being eaten by a reptile is not the kind of story that makes for a good Shakespearean play. But let's look at the context. Crocodiles were everywhere in ancient Egypt. They were both feared and revered, and they were a very real and present danger. The Nile was their domain, and they were a common sight. The possibility of a person, even a queen, being attacked by one was not beyond the realm of possibility. Now, let's circle back to the central debate. Historians still argue whether Cleopatra died by snakebite, poison, or some other means entirely. The asp story, while popular, has some major holes. First, there's the question of the snake itself. A small asp, or Egyptian cobra, is a notoriously unreliable way to die. Their bites are not always fatal, and even when they are, death is slow and agonising, a process that can take hours. It would be a messy, painful, and deeply unroyal way to go. A queen who wanted a quick, dignified death would likely have chosen a more reliable poison, perhaps a hemlock or a strychnine concoction. The Roman historian Plutarch, who is a much more reliable source, suggests that her death was caused by a dose of poison, possibly from a pin that she used to prick her arm. This would have been a much cleaner, more reliable method. Then there's the logistical problem of the snake. How did she get a live, venomous snake into her mausoleum without anyone noticing? While her servants were loyal, the building would have been under constant surveillance by Roman guards. It seems unlikely that she could have pulled off such a complicated and dangerous feat. Furthermore, Octavian, the future emperor, was a meticulous and cautious man. He had a vested interest in keeping Cleopatra alive so he could parade her through Rome. It seems unlikely that he would have allowed a live, venomous snake to be brought into her presence. The story of the figs and the snake feels more like a post-mortem attempt to give her a more romantic, dramatic end, one befitting a powerful queen. The crocodile theory, while far less romantic, at least has a kind of dark plausibility. If she did escape her mausoleum, perhaps in an attempt to flee, and somehow fell into the Nile or was attacked on the riverbanks, a crocodile would have been a very real and present danger. The lack of a body would certainly explain why there's no physical evidence of her death. But of course, there is no hard evidence to support this theory either. It's a fringe idea, a bizarre footnote in a much more famous story. Ultimately, we are left with a tantalising historical whodunit with no definitive answer. Was it a dramatic, symbolic snakebite that suited her legacy? A quick, quiet dose of poison that was more reliable and less messy? Or was it a far more gruesome and undignified end, a fate sealed by a wild animal? The answer is buried with the Queen herself, and the historical records, as is often the case, are a mixture of fact, rumour and propaganda. The Romans, in their telling of her story, had a vested interest in making her out to be a kind of villainess, a woman who used her sexuality and her cunning to manipulate powerful men. The story of her death, therefore, was likely shaped by this narrative. As you leave the hot, humid air of the Nile Delta behind, you can't help but think about how the stories we tell about the past often have less to do with the truth and more to do with our own need for narrative. The story of Cleopatra and the asp is a beautiful one, a tragic end for a legendary queen. But perhaps the truth was a little messier, a little more human, and a lot less cinematic. We're leaving the world of pharaohs and moving to a different kind of empire, one that was built not on divine right, but on pure, unadulterated power. Our next stop is ancient Rome, where an emperor, not a queen, met his end in a frantic, desperate escape. As the hot dust of the Nile Delta settles on your clothes, the landscape around you melts into the rolling, sun-drenched hills of ancient Italy. The air is no longer humid, but dry and fragrant with the scent of olive groves and wild herbs. We've left the world of queens and pharaohs and entered the heart of a vast and powerful empire, an empire ruled by a man whose name is synonymous with cruelty, madness, and spectacular self-indulgence. This is the world of the Roman Emperor Nero, and the story of his final frantic hours is a tragic and bizarre end to a reign that was filled with both artistic genius and horrifying brutality. You're no longer a detached observer. You're a ghost, a witness to the last moments of a man who at one time commanded an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. The year is 68 AD, and Nero's reign is collapsing around him. Rebellions are flaring up across the provinces, his legions are turning against him, and even the Praetorian Guard, his own personal protectors, have been bought off by his rivals. The emperor, once the most powerful man in the known world, is now a man on the run, a fugitive in his own land. The story of Nero's final journey is a mainstream historical fact, one that is documented by a number of contemporary Roman historians. On the night of June 8th, 68 AD, Nero fled his palace. A man who had once ruled the world, now disguised in a humble cloak and riding a mule, accompanied by a small handful of loyal servants. He was not a king being led in chains, but a desperate, terrified man running from his own fate. They rode through the night, but they could not outrun the inevitable. His plans to escape to the sea were foiled by a series of bad omens and a general sense of panic. He was forced to retreat to a small villa owned by one of his freedmen, a place far from the opulence he was used to. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a kind of dark humour to the story. As Nero was on the run, a courier passed by on horseback carrying a dispatch with news that was, to put it mildly, not good. The courier announced that the Senate had declared Nero a public enemy and had condemned him to a pinochle, or penalty of the sack. This was a truly horrifying form of execution that involved being sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a monkey, and a viper, and then being thrown into the Tiber River. The thought of this grotesque fate, a cruel and humiliating end, must have been a terrifying prospect for the emperor. Imagine the fear and disgust on his face as he realised what awaited him if he was captured. It was a fate so degrading, so utterly unroyal, that it forced his hand. Nero's final hours were a frantic, pathetic spectacle. He was a man who loved the arts, a poet and a musician, but he couldn't even manage a clean, quick death. He asked his servants to dig his grave, all the while muttering, "What an artist dies in me." He hesitated, crying and lamenting, unable to bring himself to do the deed. This is a crucial point in the narrative, as it highlights his deep-seated cowardice and his almost theatrical self-pity. He wasn't a brave hero facing his end. He was a terrified man who needed to be prodded into his own suicide. Eventually, with the sound of approaching hoofbeats, He finally put a dagger to his throat, but not before his private secretary Epaphroditus had to help him plunge the blade in. His final words were, as we know from history, a testament to his inflated ego and his love for his own artistic talents. And this is where the historical debate comes in. Historians still argue whether Nero was a depraved monster or a misunderstood artist and ruler who was a victim of political propaganda. On the one hand, you have the Nero who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, the man who murdered his own mother and wife, and the emperor who persecuted Christians with a terrifying brutality. This is the mainstream, widely accepted view of Nero. The stories of his cruelty and his extravagance are legendary, and they paint a picture of a man who was utterly unhinged and a danger to his own people. His death, in this context, was a just and deserved end to a tyrannical reign. However, there is a fringe, revisionist view that argues Nero was a brilliant but flawed artist who was a victim of a vicious smear campaign by his political enemies. This view holds that the stories of his depravity were exaggerated or fabricated by the Senate and the historians who served the new Flavian dynasty. They had a vested interest in making Nero look as bad as possible to legitimize their own rule. They point to the fact that Nero was a popular ruler with the common people of Rome, and that many of his policies were aimed at helping the poor and the downtrodden. The fact that his death was followed by a period of chaos and civil war suggests that he wasn't universally hated, and that many people still saw him as their legitimate emperor. Was he a monster, or was he just a man with a fragile ego who was in over his head? The truth, as is often the case, is probably a complex mix of both. As you stand in the overgrown villa where Nero spent his last moments, you can feel the desperation in the air. The emperor's final act was not one of courage, but of cowardice. A pathetic and lonely end to a life lived on a grand theatrical scale. His death ushered in a period of civil war known as the Year of the Four Emperors, a brutal reminder that without a strong legitimate ruler, the great Roman Empire could descend into chaos. The man who had been the face of absolute power for over a decade died a fugitive. His final words a kind of bitter, self-pitying lament. It's a sad and bizarre end to a life that was so full of spectacle and cruelty. We leave the Roman hills and travel to a very different time and place, a medieval French kingdom where a king's death was not the result of war or betrayal, but of an absurd, almost comical accident. Our next story is about a king who died not by a sword or a dagger or a poison, but by a pig. As the ghost of a self-pitying Roman emperor fades into the Italian landscape, we find ourselves in a very different world, one of mud, straw, and an absurdity so profound it's almost comical. We are in the 12th century France, and the air is heavy with the smell of wet earth and livestock. We're here to talk about a king whose death was not the result of a battle, a conspiracy or a tragic illness, but of a farmyard animal. This is the bizarre, tragic and frankly ridiculous story of King Louis VI, who was said to have died from being crushed by a pig. You're no longer a witness to a grand historical drama. You're a spectator to a kind of medieval slapstick comedy, one with a very serious and very sad ending. Imagine the scene, a busy muddy street in the town of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a place bustling with vendors, peasants, and the usual hustle and bustle of medieval life. The king, a man who had built a reputation as a great warrior and a defender of the common people, is riding through the streets on his horse. He's a large, imposing man, a man whose presence should have commanded respect and fear. But on this day, his fate was sealed not by a rival king or a rebellious noble, but by a runaway sow. The story, as it has been passed down through the centuries, is a mainstream historical fact, though its details are often treated with a healthy dose of scepticism. In the year 1131, the king's son, also named Philip, was riding through the streets of Paris. As a quirky or fringe tidbit, the death was not the king's but his son's, a detail often lost in the more sensational headlines. The pig, a large heavy sow, suddenly broke free from its pen and ran into the street. The king's horse, spooked by the animal, reared up, and the young prince, who was riding a little too close to the action, was thrown to the ground. He landed awkwardly, and the pig, in its frantic escape, ran over him. The prince died from his injuries shortly after. His death was a tragedy, but it was also a warning. A simple accident, one that could have happened to anyone, had claimed the life of a future king. The death of the heir was a profound blow to King Louis VI, a man who had been a kind of father figure to his nation. He was a physically imposing man, a fat king as he was known, but he was also a man of great intellect and political acumen. The death of his son was a loss so profound it sent him into a spiral of grief and despair. The loss, combined with his already failing health, was too much for him to bear. He fell into a deep depression, and his physical health began to fail. His grief was a slow kind of death, one that was far more insidious than a quick, violent end. And this is where the historical debate comes in. Historians still argue whether the story of the pig is the full story, or if it's just a tragic detail in a more complex narrative. The mainstream historical consensus is that the king died of a long-standing illness, a kind of debilitating fever and dysentery that had been plaguing him for years. His death was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a long, drawn-out decline. The death of his son, in this version of the story, was a kind of final straw, a tragic catalyst that hastened an end that was already inevitable. The story of the pig, therefore, is a kind of historical red herring, a sensational detail that distracts from the more mundane and more medically accurate truth. However, there is a fringe view, one that clings to the pig story with a kind of stubborn, historical glee. This view argues that the death of the prince was far more than a simple accident. They point out that a pig, especially a heavy sow, can be a dangerous animal. The stampede of an animal, especially in a narrow, crowded street, could have caused a panic that led to the prince's fatal fall. Furthermore, the death of a king's son by a farm animal is a kind of poetic and cosmic irony that feels almost too perfect to be made up. It's a reminder that even the most powerful rulers are at the mercy of chance, and that a king's life can be ended by the same kind of mundane tragedy that can befall a commoner. The story of the pig, in this view, is not a lie, but a kind of truth, a bizarre and profound lesson about the nature of power and fate. Imagine the scene. A king, a man who had defeated rival armies and forged a unified nation, brought low by a pig. It's a kind of dark joke that only history could tell. The death of his son, and the subsequent illness that plagued him, was a grim and heartbreaking reminder that even the most powerful of men are not immune to the random cruelty of the universe. The king who had been a symbol of strength and power was, in the end, just a man, vulnerable and heartbroken. His death, in 1137, was a quiet, private affair, a stark contrast to the public tragedy of his sons. The king, who had been a formidable warrior, died in his bed, his body worn out by grief and illness. The pig, meanwhile, lived on, oblivious to the historical drama it had set in motion. The story of King Louis VI and the pig is a kind of historical fable, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of life. It's a story that reminds us that even in a world of knights and kings, the mundane can be as deadly as the dramatic. We leave the muddy streets of medieval France and travel to a different kind of court, one that was ruled not by the sword, but by the sceptre. Our next story is about a royal family whose secrets were just as deadly as any political conspiracy. We're going to the court of the Russian Tsars, where the accidental death of a royal doctor was just the beginning of a bloody and tragic end for an entire dynasty. As the memory of a French king and a runaway pig fades, we travel eastward into the cold, stark landscape of the 18th century Russia. The air here is sharp and frigid, and the sun seems to hang low in the sky, a pale and distant orb. We are in the court of the Tsars, a world of opulent palaces, brutal politics, and deep, dark family secrets. This is a story not about a monarch, but about a man who was an essential part of the royal family's life, and whose accidental death was a harbinger of a far more profound tragedy to come. This is the story of Dr. Hermann Loder and his fateful encounter with a member of the imperial family. The setting is the court of Tsar Paul I, a monarch whose paranoia and volatile temper were a kind of low-grade fever that infected the entire palace. Paul was the son of Catherine the Great, a woman whose death was as mysterious as her reign was long and successful. Paul, a man who had waited decades for the throne, was deeply insecure and distrustful of everyone around him. His court was a place of intrigue and fear, where a misplaced word or a sidelong glance could send you to the gallows. It was a world ripe for disaster. The accidental death of Hermann Loder is a mainstream historical fact, though it's often overshadowed by the far more dramatic events that followed. Dr. Loder was a respected physician, a German-born doctor who had served the Russian court for years. He was a trusted confidant, a man who had seen the inner workings of the royal family firsthand. The day of his death was a cold, quiet morning in St. Petersburg. The doctor was walking along a cobblestone path, minding his own business, when a royal carriage travelling at a furious speed came thundering down the street. The carriage was driven by none other than one of Tsarpool's sons, Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich. Konstantin was known for his wild, reckless nature and his love of speed. The carriage was moving so fast that Loder had no time to get out of the way. He was struck, thrown to the ground, and died from his injuries a few hours later. The death was a tragedy. A terrible accident that was, in its own right, a sign of the deep dysfunction and carelessness of the royal family. But it's the reaction to the death that adds a layer of quiet, unsettling dread to the story. Grand Duke Constantine, in his panic, fled the scene, and it took a while for him to be found. When he was not punished or even reprimanded in any meaningful way. The royal family, in a stunning display of their sense of entitlement, did their best to hush up the entire affair. The family of the deceased doctor was given a small amount of money, and the story was quickly buried under layers of courtly lies and official proclamations. And here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that makes the story even more bizarre. The death of Dr. Loder was not the first time a member of the royal family had been involved in such an incident. It was said that Tsarpool I, in his younger days, had also been prone to reckless, dangerous behaviour, and had even been involved in a carriage accident that had injured a servant. The story, while unconfirmed, adds a kind of karmic irony to the situation. A family that had built an empire on blood and conquest was now, in a quiet, mundane way, a danger to its own people, a kind of self-destructive force that was spiralling out of control. It was a kind of poetic foreshadowing, a silent warning that the family's sense of invincibility was an illusion. Historians still argue whether the accidental death of Dr. Loder was truly an accident, or if it was a sign of a deeper, more systemic problem within the royal family. Some scholars argue that the incident was a kind of metaphor for the entire reign of Paul I, the Tsar's recklessness and disregard for human life, combined with his son's wild, unchecked behaviour, created an environment where such a tragedy was not just possible, but inevitable. They see it as a symbol of the Tsarist regime's crumbling authority and its growing disconnect from the reality of its subjects' lives. However, others argue that it was just a tragic, albeit poorly handled, accident. They point out that in the 18th century, with unpaved roads and no traffic laws, carriage accidents were a common occurrence. The fact that it involved a member of the royal family was, in this view, just a grim coincidence. The royal family's reaction, while certainly heartless by modern standards, was not unusual for the time. In a world where the lives of commoners were considered less valuable than those of nobles, a public hushing up of the affair was to be expected. To them, the story is not a symbol of a decaying dynasty, but a simple, sad footnote in a much larger story. The accidental death of the doctor, in a strange and eerie way, was a preamble to a much more violent and deliberate death. Tsarpool's reign was a constant state of turmoil. His paranoid, irrational behaviour had alienated his family, his ministers, and his army. His life was a kind of living death, a slow-motion descent into a world of delusion and fear. The accidental death of a doctor was just a small piece of a much larger puzzle, a piece that would be violently and brutally solved just a few months later. As you stand on the cold, cobbled streets of St. Petersburg, you can almost see the ghosts of the past. The ghost of Dr. Loder, a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the ghost of a paranoid Tsar, a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time for his entire life. The stage is set for a far more dramatic, far more deliberate act of violence. We are leaving the world of accidental death and entering a world of conspiracy, betrayal, and a bloody coup that would end a Tsar's life in a way that was as bizarre as his reign. Our next story is about the final desperate gamble of a paranoid Tsar, a man whose death was as violent as his life was full of fear. As the ghost of a royal physician fades from the cold streets of St. Petersburg, the air grows thick with a different kind of tension, one born of fear, paranoia, and the suffocating weight of absolute power. We're still in the court of the Tsars, but the stakes have been raised. The stage is set not for an accident, but for a deliberate act of regicide, a violent and brutal end to a reign that was, in its own way, a kind of waking nightmare. We're here to talk about the final days of Tsarpool I, a monarch whose life was a series of bizarre and irrational decisions, and whose death was as chaotic as his life. You're no longer a passive observer. You're an invisible presence in the Tsar's bedchamber on the night of March 23rd, 1801. The air is heavy, and the only sound is the low flicker of a candle and the muffled footsteps of guards in the hallway. You can feel the nervous energy, the unspoken fear that hangs in the air like a shroud. This is a scene of profound historical significance, a moment when the fates of a monarch and an empire hung in the balance. The death of Tsar Paul I is a mainstream historical fact, a widely documented event that is a testament to the brutal, unforgiving nature of Tsarist politics. By the year 1801, Paul had alienated almost everyone in his court. His erratic behaviour, his tyrannical decrees, and his paranoid purges had made him a danger to himself and to his own people. He was obsessed with military drills and uniforms, and his decrees often bordered on the absurd. For example, a quirky or fringe tidbit of his reign was a law he passed that banned the wearing of certain types of hats and collars, a kind of sartorial decree that was a sign of his deep-seated neuroses. He saw conspirators everywhere, and he was convinced that his family, his ministers, and his army were all plotting against him. He was right. A powerful cabal of nobles, generals, and even his own son, Alexander, had decided that the Tsar had to go. The plot was not a secret. It was an open secret, a kind of whispered conspiracy that everyone knew about but no one dared to speak of openly. The conspirators, led by Count Pahlen, the governor of St. Petersburg, and General Levin August von Benison, planned a coup. Their plan was simple: force the Tsar to abdicate. They would burst into his bedchamber, present him with a letter of abdication, and send him into exile. It was meant to be a bloodless, quiet coup, a kind of polite political assassination. But of course, nothing in Paul's life was ever quiet or polite. The conspirators, fueled by alcohol and a mix of fear and adrenaline, burst into the Tsar's room in the middle of the night. Paul, in a moment of panic and terror, tried to hide behind a screen. It was a pathetic, almost comical act, a stark contrast to the powerful, imposing figure he had tried so hard to project. The conspirators found him, and they presented him with the document. Paul, in a rage, refused to sign. The situation quickly spiralled out of control. A fight broke out, and in the chaos the Tsar was thrown to the floor. He was a large man, but he was no match for the armed men who were determined to end his reign. The details of what happened next are a kind of historical blur, a bloody and brutal mess. He was beaten, strangled, and perhaps even stabbed. The exact cause of death is a matter of historical debate, but the result was the same. The Tsar was dead and his reign of terror was over. The official cause of death was later announced as apoplexy, or a stroke, a kind of diplomatic lie that was meant to hide the brutal reality of a regicide. But the truth, as always, had a way of leaking out. The people of St. Petersburg, who had been living in a state of constant fear for years, greeted the news of his death with a kind of quiet, collective relief. A new Tsar, Alexander I, had taken the throne, and the people hoped that he would bring an end to the madness. Historians still argue whether Alexander was complicit in his father's murder. On the one hand, he was present on the night of the coup, and he certainly knew about the plot to force his father to abdicate. He had a clear motive. His father's erratic behaviour was a threat to the stability of the empire, and his own life was in danger. It's plausible to believe that he tacitly approved of the plan to remove his father from power, but that he did not expect or approve of the violent outcome. He was a deeply conflicted man, and the guilt of his father's death would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the other hand, a more fringe view argues that Alexander was not just complicit, but a full-blown co-conspirator. They point to the fact that he was the first to enter his father's bedchamber, and that he did nothing to stop the violence once it had started. They argue that he had a vested interest in his father's death, and that he was willing to go to any length to secure the throne. The murder, in this view, was not an accident, but a premeditated act of patricide, a cold and calculated move to seize power. This is a much more sinister and less forgiving interpretation of events, and it makes Alexander a far more complex and morally ambiguous figure. The death of Tsar Paul I was a grim and brutal end to a reign that was, in its own way, a kind of slow-motion suicide. The Tsar's paranoia had created an environment where such an act was not just possible, but inevitable. He had so alienated his family, his ministers and his people, that his death was not mourned, but celebrated. It was a tragic and bizarre end to a life that was full of fear and a desperate, lonely search for legitimacy. As you leave the Tsar's blood-splattered bedchamber behind, you can feel the air clear. The oppressive tension is gone, replaced by a kind of quiet relief. But the story of royal deaths is not over. We are leaving the world of Tsarist palaces and travelling to a different kind of prison, one that was ruled not by a paranoid Tsar, but by a lonely, exiled queen. Our next story is about the final dramatic moments of a woman whose life was a series of unfortunate events, and whose death was as controversial as her life. As the blood-soaked floors of a Russian palace fade from view, the air grows damp and cold once more, and a different kind of imprisonment takes its place. We're travelling to a remote, fortified castle in England, a place of grey stone, endless green fields, and a profound sense of isolation. The year is 1587, and the central figure in our story is a queen who was, for most of her life, a prisoner. This is the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, a woman whose life was a series of unfortunate events, and whose death was as dramatic and controversial as her reign. You're no longer in a bustling court or a chaotic battlefield. You're in the great hall of Fotheringhay Castle, a place that was, for the last few years of Mary's life, her gilded cage. The air is still, and you can feel the quiet, suffocating weight of her long imprisonment. Mary was a queen of two nations, France and Scotland, but she had been a captive of her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I of England, for nearly 2 decades. Her crime was her very existence. She was a Catholic heir to the English throne, a woman who many in England saw as the rightful queen, and a constant threat to Elizabeth's Protestant rule. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, is a mainstream historical fact, an event that sent shockwaves across Europe and cemented Elizabeth's place as a ruthless and powerful monarch. The official cause of her execution was her involvement in the Babington Plot, a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The evidence against her was a series of coded letters that were intercepted by Elizabeth's spymaster, Francis Walsingham. The letters, which were meant to be her lifeline, became her death warrant. She was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. But the death itself was anything but simple. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of gruesome detail to the story. Mary, with a kind of grim theatricality, was not executed by a sword, but by an axe. The executioner, a man named Bull, was by all accounts not very good at his job. The first blow of the axe missed her neck and landed on the back of her head. The crowd in the hall, which was made up of nobles, spies, and curious onlookers, gasped in horror. The second blow was still not enough. It was only on the third try that the executioner managed to sever her head. The death was brutal, clumsy, and agonizing. But the horror didn't end there. After the executioner held up her head by her hair to show the crowd. But a strange thing happened. Her head, which was covered in a wig, fell from his grasp and rolled on the floor, revealing that her hair, which had been fiery red in her youth, had turned grey and thin. The crowd was aghast. The executioner, in a final act of grim irony, was said to have been so mortified by the event that he became a laughingstock. The death of a queen, which was meant to be a swift, clean political statement, had become a grotesque and public spectacle, and this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth was truly reluctant to execute Mary. Elizabeth was a famously indecisive monarch, and she had spent years trying to find a way to get rid of Mary without having to kill her. She had tried to marry her off, to get her to renounce her claim to the throne, and even to have her tried for treason in a way that wouldn't force a public execution. The execution, when it finally happened, was not an act of triumph for Elizabeth, but an act of last resort. Proponents of this view point to the fact that Elizabeth was so angry about the execution that she had her secretary, William Davison, arrested and sent to the Tower of London. She claimed that he had sent the warrant for the execution without her permission. To them, this is a sign that she was genuinely heartbroken and conflicted about the death of her cousin. However, a more fringe, revisionist view argues that Elizabeth's reluctance was just a form of political theatre. They point out that Elizabeth was a brilliant and ruthless politician and that she would never have allowed the execution to go forward without her express permission. The arrest of Davison, in this view, was just a way to deflect blame and to show the world that she was a reluctant monarch who was forced to make a difficult decision. It was a kind of public relations move, a way to save face in the eyes of other European monarchs who saw the execution as a gross act of regicide. They argue that Elizabeth had a clear motive. Mary was a threat to her rule, and she had to be eliminated. The execution in this view was not a tragedy, but a cold, calculated act of political survival. As you stand in the ghostly Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, you can feel the weight of history. The life of Mary, Queen of Scots, was a kind of historical drama that was played out on a grand, tragic scale. She was a woman who was a victim of her own birthright, a queen who was born to be a ruler but was destined to be a captive. Her death was not just the end of a life, but the end of a long, drawn-out political struggle between two powerful, complicated women. We are leaving the grey, sombre walls of an English castle and travelling to a very different kind of prison, one that was ruled not by a queen, but by a man whose final days were spent in exile. Our next story is about a French emperor whose death was a quiet, mysterious end to a life of spectacular conquests and crushing defeats. We're going to the remote, windswept island of St. Helena, where the ghost of a poisoned emperor still lingers, as the tragic, clumsy ghost of Mary, Queen of Scots, fades from the halls of Fotheringhay. The air around you grows heavy with the thick, cloying humidity of an isolated tropical island. We are travelling to St. Helena, a remote volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, a place so desolate and so far from the centres of power that it was chosen for a very specific purpose, to be the prison of Napoleon Bonaparte. The year is 1821, and the central figure in our story is a man who at one time commanded an empire that stretched across Europe. His death in this remote prison was as quiet and unassuming as his life had been spectacular and grand. You stand on the windswept grounds of Longwood House, the dilapidated, insect-infested villa that was Napoleon's final home. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The man who had defeated kings and toppled empires was, in his final years, a prisoner of his own failing body and a British government that was determined to keep him from ever returning to power. His death, on May 5th, 1821, was a quiet, private affair, a stark contrast to the thundering cannons and grand proclamations of his life. The official cause of death was stomach cancer, a disease that had been plaguing him for years. But as with all great figures, a quiet, simple death was not enough to satisfy the public's need for a grand, dramatic story. Whispers began to circulate almost immediately, rumours that said the great emperor had not died of natural causes, but of something far more sinister. The whispers said he had been poisoned. The theory that Napoleon was poisoned with arsenic is a mainstream historical fact, though it has been a subject of intense debate for centuries. The primary evidence for this theory came in the 1960s, when a forensic analysis of a lock of Napoleon's hair, which had been collected at his death, showed that it contained a high, toxic dose of arsenic. The finding was a bombshell. It suggested that Napoleon had been a victim of a long, slow poisoning, a quiet, calculated act of murder. The suspect, his captors, the British, or perhaps his private doctor, the Corsican-born Francesco Antomarchi, or even Count Charles de Montholon, a loyal aide who was constantly by his side and who would have had ample opportunity to administer the poison. But here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of complexity to the narrative. The British, who were his captors, had a clear motive. They were terrified of him escaping and returning to power. They had already spent a fortune and lost countless lives to defeat him once. The thought of him returning to Europe was anathema to them. A quick, quiet death would have solved their problem once and for all. So it is plausible to believe that they would have wanted him dead. The British, in their defence, argued that the high levels of arsenic in his hair were not due to poisoning, but to the fact that arsenic was a common ingredient in many medicines, tonics, and even wallpapers of the time. The wallpaper in his room, for instance, was coloured with a pigment that contained arsenic, and the humidity on the island could have caused the arsenic to become airborne, which he would have then ingested. This is a crucial point, as it provides a plausible, non-malicious explanation for the high levels of arsenic in his hair. And this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. To this day, historians still argue whether Napoleon was a victim of murder or of a tragic but natural illness. Proponents of the murder theory point to the fact that Napoleon's symptoms, which included abdominal pain, a loss of appetite and a general wasting away, are all consistent with a long, slow arsenic poisoning. They also point to the fact that his doctor, Antomarchi, was a Corsican, a people who are known for their love of intrigue and their hatred of the French and the British. It's not a huge leap to imagine that he could have been an agent of the British, or even of the Bourbons, who had been restored to the French throne. However, a more recent analysis, a modern re-examination of his body, has cast a great deal of doubt on the murder theory. A 2007 study by a team of Swiss scientists concluded that the amount of arsenic in his hair, while high, was not high enough to have been fatal. They argued that the emperor died of a massive gastric hemorrhage caused by a perforated stomach ulcer, a condition that is a hallmark of advanced stomach cancer. They also pointed out that Napoleon's father had died of the same disease, which suggests a genetic predisposition. In this view, the arsenic in his hair was just a historical red herring, a kind of dramatic footnote that has been misinterpreted for decades. The arsenic was just a part of his environment, not a deliberate tool of murder. The great conqueror, in this view, was not a victim of a plot but of his own biology. As you stand on the desolate grounds of Longwood House, you can almost hear the ghost of a dying emperor. He was not a victim of a grand dramatic conspiracy, but of a quiet, slow disease that was passed down to him from his father. His death was not a historical mystery, but a medical tragedy. The man who had been a symbol of absolute power was in the end just a human being, a man who was vulnerable to the same diseases that can afflict a commoner. The story of Napoleon's death is a kind of historical fable, a cautionary tale about the human need for a good story, even if the truth is more mundane. We are leaving the remote, windswept island of St. Helena and travelling to a very different kind of world, one of grand castles, romantic ideals, and a kind of death that was as shrouded in mystery as the man who died. Our next story is about a prince whose fatal fall from a horse was either a terrible accident or a cover-up for something far more sinister. We're going to the court of Queen Victoria, where a tragic death in the royal family was not what it seemed. As the ghost of a poisoned emperor fades from the desolate shores of St. Helena, the air grows cool and crisp, and the scenery around you transforms into the manicured gardens and Gothic towers of Victorian England. We are in the year 1861, a time of grand technological and social change, a time when a queen's love for her husband was as legendary as her reign was long. The central figure in our story is Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria, a man who was, in many ways, the guiding force behind the throne. His death was a national tragedy, a moment of profound grief that plunged the Queen into a decades-long mourning. The official cause of his death was typhoid fever, a kind of historical shrug that seemed to satisfy the public's need for an explanation. But as with so many of these stories, the truth may have been far more complex and far more sinister. You stand on the damp gravel path of the Frogmore estate at Windsor, a place of quiet reflection and sombre beauty. The air is still, and you can almost feel the weight of the Queen's grief, a kind of palpable sorrow that lingers in the very air. The story of Prince Albert's final days is a mainstream historical fact, a widely documented narrative of a man who was, in his prime, a tireless worker and a devoted family man. His death, on December 14th, 1861, was a devastating blow to the nation. The official medical report cited typhoid fever, a disease that was common in the era, but the diagnosis was a bit of a historical sleight of hand. The doctors were under pressure to find a simple, clear explanation for the death of a man who was, by all accounts, in good health. A disease like typhoid, which was often linked to unsanitary conditions, was a convenient and straightforward answer, a way to close the book on a national tragedy without having to look too closely at the details. But here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of quiet, unsettling mystery to the narrative. Just a few weeks before his death, Prince Albert had travelled to Cambridge to confront his eldest son, the Prince of Wales, a man whose love of gambling, women and general dissipation was a constant source of worry for his parents. He was a kind of proto-royal rebel, a man who was determined to live life on his own terms, and his behaviour was a source of profound shame for the Prince Consort. On his way back from Cambridge, Albert was thrown from his horse. The fall was not a dramatic, bone-breaking event. It was a kind of gentle, almost imperceptible fall, a kind of stumble that was a bit too perfect to be an accident. The prince, who was an expert horseman, should have been able to handle such a minor mishap, but he was said to have been shaken by the event. He returned to Windsor, and a few days later he fell ill. He was bedridden for weeks, and his health slowly but inexorably failed. The fall, in this view, was not an accident, but a kind of cosmic sign, a premonition of the tragedy to come. And this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. Historians still argue whether Prince Albert died of typhoid fever, or if his death was the result of a long-standing and more serious illness. The typhoid fever diagnosis has been a subject of intense scrutiny for decades. The symptoms of his illness, which included fever, exhaustion, and a general malaise, were certainly consistent with typhoid. However, his illness was far more prolonged and less severe than a typical case of typhoid fever, which usually kills within a week or two. The fact that his son and other members of the royal household were not infected also suggests that the diagnosis was, at best, a convenient lie. A more plausible and more widely accepted medical explanation is that he died of Crohn's disease or even stomach cancer, a disease that would have been consistent with his symptoms and his long, drawn-out decline. The prince consort was a hypochondriac, a man who had been plagued by stomach troubles for years, and a disease like Crohn's or cancer would have been a kind of slow, quiet death that was far more insidious than a quick, violent one. The fall from the horse, in this view, was not a cause of death but a catalyst. The physical and emotional trauma of the fall, combined with his already failing health and the deep-seated worry about his son, was too much for his body to bear. It was the final straw, the one event that sent him into a spiral of illness from which he would never recover. The story of his death is, in this way, a kind of historical tragedy, a narrative of a man who was so worried about his legacy and the future of his family that he literally worried himself to death. However, a more fringe conspiracy-minded view argues that the death was a cover-up for a more sordid secret. They point to the fact that Prince Albert had an affair, a secret relationship with a young woman that was a source of great shame and scandal. The fall from the horse, in this view, was not an accident, but a kind of punishment, a way for his body to betray him for his sins. This is a much more sensational and less historically grounded theory, and it's largely dismissed by serious scholars, but it's a testament to the power of a good story and the human need to find a kind of moral lesson in even the most tragic events. As you stand in the quiet, sombre grounds of Frogmore, you can feel the weight of the Queen's grief, a kind of profound, lasting sadness that would define the rest of her reign. The death of Prince Albert was not just the end of a life, but the end of an era, a kind of golden age of Victorian optimism and progress. His death was a quiet, private affair, a stark contrast to the thundering conquests and spectacular defeats of our other stories. It was a kind of historical quietus, a moment of profound sadness that was a reminder that even the most powerful of men are, in the end, just human. We are leaving the world of Victorian grief and travelling to a different kind of court, one that was ruled not by love, but by madness. Our next story is about a queen whose mental illness was so profound that she was known as Juana the Mad, and whose jester's death was a bizarre and sad footnote in a life that was a kind of waking nightmare. As the quiet grief of a Victorian queen's mourning fades, the air around you grows thick with the weight of a different kind of sadness, one born of profound and lasting madness. We are travelling to 16th century Spain, to the cold, oppressive walls of the royal palace of Tordesillas, a place that was, for decades, the gilded prison of Queen Juana of Castile. Her story is a tragic one, a narrative of a queen who was known not for her power or her glory, but for her mental illness. This is the story of her isolation, her suffering, and the bizarre, tragic death of her jester, a man who was, in his own way, as much a prisoner as she was. You're a ghost in the long, dark hallways of the palace, a witness to a kind of living death. The air is cold and still, and you can hear the faint, muffled sounds of a woman's sobs coming from behind a heavy, iron-bound door. Queen Juana, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, was known as Juana the Mad, a moniker that was as much a political tool as it was a description of her mental state. Her mental instability, which began in her youth and was exacerbated by the death of her husband, Philip the Handsome, was a kind of open secret, a fact that her father and later her son, Charles V, used to keep her from the throne. They locked her away, a kind of royal inconvenience, a queen who was too unstable to rule, and whose very existence was a threat to their power. The story of Queen Juana's life is a mainstream historical fact, a widely documented narrative of a woman who was a victim of both her own fragile psyche and a ruthless political system. She was a woman of great intelligence and education, but her mind was a fractured landscape of jealousy, obsession, and grief. Her greatest obsession was with her dead husband, Philip. She refused to bury him for years, carrying his coffin with her as she wandered through Spain, convinced that he would one day rise from the dead. This obsessive grief, combined with her other delusions, was all the justification her family needed to keep her imprisoned. And this leads us to the heart of our bizarre little story. The Queen, in her long isolation, had a few trusted servants and a jester, a man who was, in a way, her only link to the outside world. He was a kind of comfort, a source of distraction in her long, lonely days. His death is a quirky or fringe tidbit, a kind of bizarre footnote in a much larger story. The jester, whose name has been lost to history, was a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a part of the royal family's household. He was a trusted companion, a kind of emotional support in a world of profound grief and isolation. The jester's death was as bizarre as it was tragic. A mob of local peasants who were angry about a new tax had gathered outside the palace. They were loud, angry, and they were looking for a fight. The jester, in an attempt to distract them or maybe to calm them down, went outside. He was met not with laughter, but with a kind of brutal, unthinking violence. The mob, in a fit of rage, killed him. The jester, who was in his own way as much a victim as the Queen, died not for a political cause, but for a random, senseless act of violence. The death was a kind of brutal reminder that even in the most secure of places, a life can be ended by a random act of fate. And this is where the historical debate comes in. Historians still argue whether the death of the jester was a random act of mob violence, or if it was a deliberate act of political murder. On the one hand, a more straightforward historical view argues that the death was a simple, tragic accident. The jester, in his naivety, had stumbled into a situation he couldn't control. The mob, in its rage, had not seen him as a man, but as a symbol of the royal family that they hated. His death was a kind of collateral damage, a kind of unfortunate side effect of a political protest. However, a more fringe, conspiracy-minded view argues that the jester was a kind of martyr, a man who was deliberately sacrificed to send a message. They point to the fact that the jester was one of the few people who had access to the Queen. He was a man who knew her secrets, her fears, and her hopes. A mob, in this view, would have been a perfect cover for a political assassination. The king, in his paranoia, would have had a vested interest in silencing anyone who had a close relationship with his mother. The death of the jester, in this view, was not an accident, but a cold, calculated act of murder, a way to ensure that the Queen's secrets would die with her. This is a much more sinister and less forgiving interpretation of events, and it makes the king a far more morally ambiguous figure. The death of the jester was a kind of mirror to the Queen's own life. She was a woman who was a victim of her own mind, a prisoner in her own palace. The jester, who was a kind of comic relief in her tragic life, died a brutal, tragic death. His death was a kind of final, brutal reminder that even in a world of royalty and power, a life can be ended by a random, senseless act of violence. The story of Queen Juana and her jester is a kind of historical fable, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of fate. As you leave the dark, oppressive halls of the palace, you can almost hear the ghost of a jester, a man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. His death was a kind of grim, ironic end to a life that was meant to be one of laughter and joy. The story reminds us that even in a world of kings and queens, a life can be ended by a random, senseless act of violence. We are leaving the world of madness and tragedy and travelling to a different kind of court, one that was ruled not by a mad queen, but by a king whose death was as mysterious as his life was full of eccentricities. Our next story is about a king whose death in a lake was either a suicide or a murder, a historical whodunit that has puzzled scholars for over a century. As the tragic ghost of a jester and a mad queen fades from the cold walls of a Spanish palace, the air around you grows crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees and the stillness of a deep, dark lake. We are travelling to 19th century Bavaria, a land of fairy tale castles and romantic, idealised landscapes. The central figure in our story is a king who was, in his own way, as mad as the queen we just left behind. This is the story of King Ludwig II, the Mad King of Bavaria, a monarch who built a series of magnificent castles and whose death was as mysterious as his life was full of eccentricities. You are a silent observer on the shores of Lake Starnberg, a place of profound beauty that was, on a quiet night in June of 1886, a scene of profound tragedy. The air is still, and you can almost feel the weight of a century-old mystery that hangs over the water like a shroud. King Ludwig II was a monarch who was known not for his military conquests or his political acumen, but for his love of art, music, and architecture. He was a kind of anachronism, a man who belonged to an earlier, more romantic era. He was a patron of the composer Richard Wagner, and he spent his reign and a large portion of the state treasury building a series of magnificent castles, including the famous Neuschwanstein, a castle so grand and so beautiful that it looks like something from a Disney movie. The official story of King Ludwig's death is a mainstream historical fact, a widely documented narrative of a king who was declared insane and then found dead in a lake. The story goes like this. By 1886, the Bavarian government had had enough of the king's extravagant spending and his erratic behaviour. They had him declared insane by a commission of doctors, and he was deposed and taken into custody. On the night of June 13th, 1886, he was at his castle, Schloss Berg, on the shores of Lake Starnberg. He went for a walk with one of the doctors from the commission, a man named Dr. Bernhard von Guden. The two men left the castle in the early evening, and they never returned. Their bodies were found in the shallow water of the lake a few hours later. The official verdict was that the king had committed suicide by drowning, and that the doctor had died while trying to save him. But here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that adds a layer of complexity to the narrative. The king was an excellent swimmer. He had a profound love for the water, and he was known to swim for hours on end, even in the cold waters of the Bavarian lakes. The idea that he, a strong, powerful man, would drown in the shallow waters of a lake, especially in an area that was known to be no more than knee-deep, is a bit of a stretch. The water, in fact, was so shallow that the king's body was found floating near the shore. The fact that he was an excellent swimmer, combined with the fact that he drowned in shallow water, has led many to believe that his death was not a suicide but a murder. And this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. To this day, historians still argue whether the king's death was a suicide or a murder. Proponents of the suicide theory point to the fact that the king was a deeply depressed and melancholic man, a man who had lived his entire life in a kind of waking dream, and who was now facing the brutal reality of being deposed and imprisoned. His dreams of building a romantic, perfect kingdom had been shattered, and he was now a king without a throne, a man without a purpose. It's plausible to believe that he would have been so heartbroken and so ashamed that he would have wanted to end his life. The fact that the doctor's body was found nearby is just a tragic coincidence. A man who, in his attempt to save his patient, had also lost his life. This is the official and most widely accepted view. However, a more fringe, conspiracy-minded view argues that the death was a murder, a political assassination orchestrated by the very people who had him declared insane. They point to the fact that the king's enemies, who were a group of powerful ministers and nobles, had a clear motive. They were terrified of the king, who they saw as a kind of a financial and political liability. They were afraid that if he were to be rehabilitated or if he were to escape, he would have a kind of moral and popular authority that would be a threat to their power. A quick, quiet death would have solved their problem once and for all. They also point to the fact that the king's body showed no signs of a struggle, and that the doctor's body, which was found near the king's, had bruises on his head and neck, suggesting that he had been in a fight. They argue that the king was a victim of a political assassination, a cold and calculated act of murder that was meant to hide the truth. The death of King Ludwig II is a kind of historical whodunit, a mystery that has been shrouded in rumours and speculation for over a century. The lack of a clear, definitive answer has allowed for both narratives to coexist, fueling a debate that shows no signs of resolution. Was he a man who was so heartbroken that he took his own life, or was he a king who was murdered by his own ministers? The answer, as is so often the case, is buried with the king himself. As you stand on the shores of Lake Starnberg, you can feel the profound sadness that hangs in the air. The death of King Ludwig II was not just the end of a life, but the end of a kind of a dream, a kind of romantic, idealised era that was, in its own way, as fragile as glass. His death was a quiet, private affair, a stark contrast to the grand public spectacles of his life. It was a kind of final quietus, a moment of profound sadness that was a reminder that even the most powerful of men are, in the end, just human. We are leaving the world of romantic castles and tragic deaths, and travelling to a different kind of mystery, one that was born not of a king, but of a curse. Our final story is about the bizarre and terrifying deaths that surrounded the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, a story that is as much about history as it is about the supernatural. As the tragic ghostly presence of a mad king fades from the shores of a Bavarian lake, the air around you grows dry and thick with a different kind of mystery, one born not of madness or murder, but of a curse. We're returning to the hot, dusty landscape of ancient Egypt, to the Valley of the Kings, and to the very tomb of Tutankhamun. The year is 1922, and the central figures in our story are a determined archaeologist and a wealthy financier, men who are about to uncover the greatest archaeological find of all time, and in doing so, unleash a kind of supernatural force that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. You are a silent witness to a scene of profound historical significance, a moment when a door that had been sealed for over 3,000 years was about to be opened. The air is thick with the dust of ages, and you can almost feel the anticipation, the profound sense of wonder and awe that must have filled the hearts of Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon as they stood on the precipice of history. Carter, after years of painstaking, fruitless searching, had finally found it, the intact tomb of the boy king. When Carnarvon asked him what he saw, Carter famously replied, "Wonderful things." And he was right. The tomb was filled with gold, jewels and artifacts beyond imagination. It was a discovery that would captivate the world and forever change our understanding of ancient Egypt. But the story, as is so often the case, had a darker side. A few weeks after the tomb was opened, a series of bizarre and terrifying events began to unfold, a kind of spooky, supernatural drama that has been a part of the Tutankhamun story ever since. The story of the Curse of the Pharaohs is a mainstream historical fact, a widely documented narrative of a series of strange and seemingly unrelated deaths that occurred shortly after the tomb was opened. The most famous victim of the curse was Lord Carnarvon himself. A few months after the discovery, he was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. The bite became infected, and he died a few weeks later of blood poisoning. The death was a kind of a perfect storm of bad luck, a man who had survived a long drawn-out excavation and a treacherous journey to the tomb, only to be felled by a tiny insignificant insect. But here is a quirky or fringe tidbit that makes the story even more bizarre. The night Lord Carnarvon died, the lights in Cairo were said to have gone out for a few minutes, a kind of citywide blackout that was seen by many as a sign of the curse. Furthermore, Lord Carnarvon's dog, a faithful terrier named Susie, was said to have let out a mournful howl and then dropped dead at the exact same moment that her master had passed away thousands of miles away. It's the kind of spooky, too perfect to be true detail that adds a kind of supernatural flair to the story. It's a kind of historical folklore, a kind of urban legend that has been passed down from generation to generation, and this leads us to the heart of the historical debate. To this day, historians still argue whether the curse was real or if it was just a series of coincidences that have been sensationalized over the years. Proponents of the curse theory point to the fact that over a dozen people who were involved in the excavation died in the years that followed. Arthur Mace, one of Carter's team members, died a few months after Carnarvon. George J. Gould, a wealthy American financier who had visited the tomb, died a few months after him, and the list goes on. The deaths were a kind of relentless, unstoppable force that seemed to be a kind of cosmic punishment for disturbing the pharaoh's eternal rest. The curse, in this view, was a real and powerful force, a kind of spiritual retribution that was meant to protect the sanctity of the king's tomb. However, a more sceptical and more widely accepted view argues that the curse was nothing more than a historical fabrication, a sensational story that was concocted by the journalists of the day. They point to the fact that many of the people who were involved in the excavation lived long, healthy lives. Howard Carter, the man who had the most to gain from the discovery, and who had spent the most time in the tomb, lived for another 16 years after the discovery. And the people who died were often elderly or in poor health. Lord Carnarvon, for example, had been in ill health for years, and he had a history of respiratory problems. A mosquito bite and a subsequent infection in his weakened state would have been enough to kill him. The deaths, in this view, were not a result of a supernatural force, but of a kind of mundane and more common reality, the perils of travel, old age, and a lack of modern medicine. The story of the curse is a kind of a historical fable, a kind of a modern myth that was born from a combination of a lack of scientific knowledge, a love for a good story, and the desire to find a kind of a dramatic and supernatural explanation for a series of random tragic events. It's a testament to the power of a legend, a testament to how the human need for a good story can often supersede the need for hard, cold facts. The curse, in the end, was not a real and powerful force, but a kind of a media circus, a kind of a historical sideshow that has been a part of the Tutankhamun story for a century. As you stand at the entrance of the tomb, the air feels a little less mystical, a little more grounded in reality. The story of Tutankhamun is a story of a boy king, a story of a lost civilization, and a story of a curse that was, in the end, nothing more than a myth. His tomb, which was meant to be his eternal resting place, became a kind of stage, a kind of a historical theatre where a series of bizarre and tragic events would unfold. The king, in his death, was not just a historical figure but a kind of a pop culture icon, a kind of a supernatural celebrity whose story would be told and retold for generations to come. And so, we've reached the end of our journey, a journey through the bizarre and often tragic deaths of royalty. We've seen kings fall from pigs, queens beheaded by clumsy executioners, and emperors poisoned by their own ambitions. We've seen a world of power and privilege that was, in the end, just as fragile and just as messy as our own. We've seen that the lives of royalty are not always a fairy tale, and that their deaths are not always a simple end to a story. They're often a kind of a beginning, a kind of a historical mystery that has a way of lingering long after the person is gone. Welcome back from the tombs, the palaces, and the battlefields. Let the air in your room grow still again. Let the whispers of history fade, and let the soft glow of your bedside lamp guide you back to the quiet familiarity of your own space. The stories we've shared tonight of bizarre ends and lingering questions aren't meant to haunt you, but to remind you that the past is a messy, beautiful, and often very human thing. There's comfort in that, in knowing that even the grandest figures of history were, at their core, just people grappling with fate, fear, and a little bit of bad luck. The world is full of unsolved mysteries, and maybe that's okay. It's what keeps us curious, keeps us dreaming, and keeps us coming back for one more story. Now close your eyes, let your mind drift and find your own quiet peace. Sleep well.